And we are joined now by Jim Pfaff of the conservative caucus to really talk about where this stands between Israel and Iran. Thank you, Jim, for coming back on Right Side Broadcasting Network Live. Are you surprised at all by the preemptive strike and what seems to be, at least from the Israeli government, as a defense strategy against the Iranian mullahs and their leadership?
Well, I'm not surprised that Israel wanted to get involved in this way. I think there was clearly reason to be concerned about Iran's nuclear program and how far along it had come. I mean, this is a cacophony of different inputs that have led to this point. The really ill-conceived JCPOA that was begun during the Obama administration, which actually strengthened the hand of the Iranian mullahs, and frankly, at the end of the day, helped promote their program to try to get nuclear weapons. Their purpose for getting nuclear weapons was entirely destructive and eschatological from a religious perspective, if you really consider it. And Trump rightly got out of it and did have Iran backed in a corner until Joe Biden comes on the scene and expands it further. I mean, listen, there are always concerns about Israeli intervention anywhere in the Middle East from a military perspective, but one can hardly blame them for their deep concern. Now, I have concerns about how this is going to play out, especially not only based upon what you're reading, but Trump also put out on Truth Social just the words unconditional surrender. This seems to be ramping up into something very serious, and it seems that Donald Trump is seriously considering military action. And so, you know, you get into a place where a concurrence of events comes together, which proposes a likely outcome. And I hope we're not going to go in and strike militarily. I think that there are a lot of problems that, you know, just fraught to be brought up into that situation. But here we are.
Developing situations, and many presidents really faced that. If you go all the way back to, let's just say, Thomas Jefferson or even John Adams with the Alien and Sedition Act, you have philosophies and arguments before they enter the presidency. And then based on what's happening on the ground, they might change that, i.e. Thomas Jefferson's purchase in the Louisiana Purchase. That was a lot of money back in that time in order to expand the United States as it did. But as you look all these centuries and years later, how that ended up working out well for us from sea to shining sea, even to today's day and age where you have someone like a Barack Hussein Obama, as you mentioned, because he was someone who was very fraught against George W. Bush's interventionist foreign policy of the nation building, but in turn seemed to enhance that with all of the droning and really not reaching out to Congress, but acting first and then saying, oh, maybe I need authorization, but we'll see about that. Even Dennis Kucinich said it was an impeachable offense the way Barack Obama used the military. Is it maybe a change on the ground here that the president might see something, although he said it's the last resort, every option is on the table?
Well, when you're saying unconditional surrender, that's and the fact that J.D. Vance put out a post saying Donald Trump's going to make the best opinion possible, that means that, in my mind at least, that this is being seriously considered. But think about some of the historical examples that you made. When it came to just Thomas Jefferson, if we just put it there, listen, Napoleon really needed the money at the time. Plus, we had always the potential threat of French intervention into American affairs on our own land, on our own continent. And that is a very serious thing. The other action that Jefferson took internationally was he engaged the Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean Sea. But again, that was a direct threat to American merchants who were doing business in the region, and you can make a case for him intervening in that way and protecting those interests. But when you fast forward to today, listen, it's in everyone's interest that Iran not have a nuclear weapon under the current regime that's there in Iran, because they're frankly crazy. They're frankly willing to do anything. They've got a religious way of thinking about this that says that they need to destroy Israel. Then that becomes a very serious thing. But in terms of our direct interests, I question the direct interest we have there. I mean, people keep making this argument that Israel's interests are ours. And listen, Israel's a great ally, and I think that they're a free society, and there's much praiseworthy to be said there. They built an economy that is fantastic, literally out of the desert over many decades, and so they should be praised for that. But to say that all of Israel's interests are directly ours becomes a very slippery slope, because it's just not the case. We just have emerged out of trillions of dollars spent in intervention in Afghanistan and Iraq that I think any objective observer would say was an abject failure. I mean, yeah, you toppled a couple regimes, but now you've just created new regime problems, and that can very well happen if we were trying to take out the mullahs directly as Americans. If we were trying to take out the mullahs in Iran, and to be candid, if the Iranian regime can be taken down, to have any new, better regime installed requires help. You just can't prop up a regime suddenly without some foreign help. And the only foreign actor that really is capable of doing that in a substantive degree, with a very large army that is supportive of the current regime in Iran, that means the United States. And how is that really, our thing to do? I think that it's fraught with a myriad of problems that can arise and that can cause us to get right back into another Iraq.
I like where we're analyzing this, Jim, together, because it's the historical context and the 4D chess of the American presidency and those decisions that ultimately have to be made. That's why I'm a huge fan, actually, not so much of George W. Bush's presidency, as you were mentioning with the nation building, but in his museum, you can actually go in there and they pre-record the former president and members of the cabinet and in his administration on a number of scenarios that would happen from country to country, on issue to issue, that they dealt with. It's called Decision Points Theater, based on his autobiography. To your point with Jefferson, it's literally in the Marine song, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. They were the first foreign terrorist organization that we had dealt with as a young nation post winning our independence. And it does parallel into now with how the Iranians were funding the Houthi rebels to literally pirate off of the Gulf states and within the Persian Gulf. So we know how happy the Gulf states were to handle the Houthi situation along with the Americans. But what do we have here? Do we have a situation where it might be like Neville Chamberlain, where it's, there's this appeasement like Barack Obama and autopen Joe Biden did in the past, leading perhaps to this 12 or so years down the road? Or do you really have now an Iranian regime that is weakened? We see that President Trump taking off the sanctions from Syria because that civil war resulted in Bashar al-Assad falling, and his father was the dictator there. I thought we never would see that day, almost an Iranian puppet state. So was this really the perfect storm and the opportunity for the Israeli military to finally make that move?
Well, shoot, I mean, it's really hard to say that I can be fully excited about it. Not because of the prospect of getting rid of a radical and frankly terrorist regime. That is obviously a positive thing. The question is what comes after and how do you get there? And that is a mess, even in Iran. Now, there are definitely large portions of the Iranian public who would cheer the overthrow of the mullahs and get a new regime in there. In fact, there's real support in a large portion of the Iranian populace for the reinstallation of Reza Pahlavi to replace his grandfather as Shah of Iran. And yeah, that may be a positive thing for many Iranians, but there still is, not in the same way as Iraq, but there still is a culture that has a mix of other people in the region. people from Azerbaijan, Armenians. You've got people that are historically connected to Turkey, and there are potential divisions there. So it can be a very messy situation. And the question is, how do you manage that? I don't know how you manage that except with boots on the ground. And that is a real challenge that we have to face if we were to do that. But in terms of the timing and everything, and by the way, just back to Syria, listen, it is no doubt that Assad really caused a lot of problems in the region. But even though Donald Trump has an olive branch out to the Syrian regime that is in place right now, it's not entirely certain that that they're going to turn out well, because the current leader was involved with the ISIS effort in the region, and there's a lot of risk in connecting too closely with them. I mean, I agree with Trump's approach there. He's trying to find peace, and he's always trying to get these countries to come into an area where they focus on economic development and the good of their people, as opposed to belligerent military regimes that are always seeking action in the area that cause instability. And Iran has been very unstable in the region. But so the question that we have to ask ourselves is, if we were to get into kinetic activity to finally topple completely the regime, are the countries in the region willing to come in and do the heavy lifting? Historically, that's not been the case. They look to us to do it, and then it turns out in the way that Iraq has, which the whole Iraq affair cost thousands of American lives, tens of thousands of Iraqi lives, and a regime that is really not a whole lot better than the one it replaced. So this is the concern I have as I look into this. But, you know, something good may come out of it. I remember my friend Charlie Gasparino of Fox Business put out a post on X where he said, you know, maybe we'll have a black swan event and everything turns out great. Yeah, I hope so. But that is dependent upon the Iranian people coming on board very quickly behind some positive outcome. And that's very challenging to do when you already have radical interests that are supportive of the current regime still living in that country. So we'll see how this plays out, but I think that we have to be aware of those concerns when we consider what the outcome might be.
And mixed with that neoliberal, neocon foreign policy of nation building that created that vacuum really over the last 25, 30 years, because that's what's the strength, I think, of President Trump in that deal-making prowess. He famously went into his first term with President Obama asking him to come over when he was president-elect in the Oval Office and saying, North Korea is going to start a war with you, and you're going to have to face that in your term. And he asked him, did you ever pick up the phone and talk to Kim Jong-un, famously a couple of years later, and the exchange of really some forward letters, and Little Rocket Man ended up welcoming the president into North Korea. And I think the first president to do that in at least half a century, at least post the Korean conflict, which still has never been settled, that DMZ zone technically active. And we've even seen leaders after President Trump going over that threshold, still looking through with the binoculars over to the other side of a very doom and gloom situation. And we don't know exactly how those citizens would react if there were a so-called regime change in North Korea. Do we have any idea how the Iranian population would react if their leadership would fail in these efforts, and then they would have to have a replacement government?
I don't know that we have an absolute clear understanding of that. I mean, we've been told for many years, and there's probably a large grain of truth to it, that a major portion of the population would like to be free of this regime. But then you've got to put things back together. And that's not an easy thing. That literally is nation building. I mean, consider building a nation. You're literally, in a way, starting from scratch. Cultures exist and people operate in their individual lives in a certain way. But even with our own country, what has made us a stable country for all this time is we already had systems in place prior to the revolution that had governing principles that were consistent with what we were quickly able to put together on the back end. And that not without conflict, because we were under the Articles of Confederation for some years prior to a constitution being implemented. And that was, something we didn't know what the outcome would be. In fact, states initially were resisting it. There was a major public policy or public discussion effort to try to encourage states like New York. I mean, we have the Federalist Papers because of letters that were being written into New York papers trying to advance the principles of the Constitution, because New York State was not absolutely going to accept it. So there were even some questions with that. There's natural instability in all these changes. But what we had that is different than most other countries that make major changes to their governing bodies, we already had a system in the states that was easily translatable into a federal government that could undertake the governing that's there. That's not always the case in other countries. So yes, is there hope that something really good could come out of Iran? I think there's reason to think that that's possible, but you're talking about a change out of a system that's been so harmful to those people over a period now of 50 years. I mean, think about this was 1979. We're talking about a 45-year history, more than 45-year history of a radical regime acting in a radical manner with time to inject over a successive generation that same radical way of thinking through its public education and its cultural institutions. That's what you're trying to overcome here. And even though there would be a large portion of the country that would be positive for this change, you have to ask, are they ready for it? And can they overcome the obvious opposition that will happen from the remnants of this regime that will inevitably remain there?
Fantastic points, because it's so true with our revolution that it was so unique in human history that a straw man could have emerged, but these great minds dialogued and they knew their history and they were inspired by the Republican form of governments that came before, especially Rome, and then even citing the Magna Carta. And here's the fun fact as well, 9 of these 13 colonies that were so different in extraordinary ways, you had to be a card-carrying Christian in order to even serve in those early Articles of Confederation, leading to what is now the United States of America. And even a difference within that, in Maryland, that was more reserved for the Catholics. That's where they were. The rest of the 8 of the 9, you had to be a card-carrying Protestant at the time. So it's very unique. Think about all these other things that surround the United States as it dates back to even the War of 1812 and what Andrew Jackson had to deal with on his front for the Battle of New Orleans. He's dealing with the British. The Spanish still have interests in Florida, all while surrounded by Indian tribes that may or may not have been friends to the United States. And then the Creek and Cherokee Wars, I can just go on, but it's similar in the sense to now with, in Iraq, for example, although Saddam Hussein was evil and horrible, he actually treated the Christian population in such a way that was, oh, I'll leave you alone. This is more of a Sunni Shia issue, as we saw in the 10 years war between Iraq and Iran, that sadly our government sent them all weapons and it did not work out. It's a little thing called blowback that the CIA has coined ever since really the 1950s, and just something to be aware of as we look at all of this, because I think it really transcends ideology, and it's that question of we the people, this beautiful positive populist movement that has taken the form of MAGA. How does that interact with a military-industrial complex that Dwight D. Eisenhower warned us about, that Ronald Reagan had to stand up against, that JFK arguably lost his life for, and now the true citizen servant, President Donald Trump, 10 years after coming down that golden escalator, is now really between a rock and a hard place, wanting to make sure that the United States remains safe as well as our allies. And we'll see, this is this pivotal moment of the deal maker in chief. Can he execute on those great principles while keeping the Western world safe?
Well, I don't envy the position he's in. I think he's up to that task. And that's one of the aspects of his greatness as a political leader, is to try to deal with those things. And so, I mean, you have to have a question about how well that all can play about. I think that that Donald Trump has done yeoman's work around the world to try to build for peace instead of build for war. And when you mention the military-industrial complex, like the good thing about the military-industrial complex is their capability to create arms and weapons that can help us defend ourselves and help us remain strong. That is greatly to their benefit, even though it's a highly inefficient system when you put it under government control. But that is really there. But they have to be held at heel, as Dwight Eisenhower knew, because you could have this overbearing desire for that system to explode into something very dangerous. And one of the aspects in which Dwight Eisenhower was quite right in his concerns is the fact that since World War I, we have been in far more wars as a country than we ever were beforehand. And every one of our wars, and prior to that, except for the Spanish-American War, and maybe the Barbary Pirates thing, but that was kind of a minor conflict by comparison. But other than the Spanish-American War, they were all defensive wars. Even the Civil War, in a sense, was a defensive war because you had an effort to bifurcate the country into two regions. But going back to Iran, I might point this out as well. In the United States, there's one other major factor that we had, and it resided in one man, that really allowed us to be able to become the country we did. It's well noted that George III at the time, right after the Revolution, said that if George Washington doesn't, and I'm paraphrasing, George Washington doesn't make himself a king, he'll be the greatest man in the world. Well, we had a George Washington who was a self-restrained individual who was willing to understand something much greater than himself with the very real temptation of power and authority. That you just go back to Lord of the Rings, that whole story. I mean, everyone wants the ring of power, right? I mean, George Washington was faced with a very similar dilemma. And what did he choose to do? He chose to see a nation built rather than to see some kingdom for himself. I don't know who that person is in Iran if this thing topples down. And I don't know that Reza Pahlavi is that man. I mean, his family had a poor track record. Now I'm very positive he's been very kind to Israel and very thoughtful, and I think his motives are probably very good. He seems like a pretty decent man in some ways. The question is the capability and skill as a leader. And if it's not him, who else is it? Well, it's more likely to be along the lines of the current radical regime that's there, and someone out of that ilk, if not directly from that regime, who might also have a claim to power. But I don't know who that person is in Iran. And I think, whenever you're wanting to topple a regime, those are incredibly serious questions that even great countries like ours cannot have full control over unless we want a massive occupation of American troops. We just did that in Iraq, and it didn't work. And I don't know that it could necessarily work in a place like Iran, which is a more homogeneous country in terms of its identity as Persians and Iranians than even Iraq was.
Jim Pfaff, president of the Conservative Caucus, we always love to have you on for your in-depth analysis, historical perspective, all while honoring Old Glory right behind your shoulder. And I join you. We pray for the peace of Israel, the peace of the Persian culture, which is one of the finest in all of world's history, and of course, the peace and prosperity, as President Trump and Vice President Vance have been very clear, of our most precious commodity, the United States soldier. Thank you, sir, for joining us, and we look forward to having you on again very soon.
Thanks. And very quick, the Persian culture is a great culture, and we need to pray for Donald Trump to have wisdom, right wisdom in all this. But thank you for your time and having me on.
Amen. Thank you, sir.